All right, welcome back. In our second lecture, I want to look at John chapters 11 and 12. Um, Before we jump into John 11, it's important that we look at the background that has already been laid, or the foundation has already been laid by John for understanding this chapter. Because in John chapter 11, we come to the issue of resurrection. And it's interesting that some people look at the Gospel of John and see in it this view of the afterlife that's similar to the Greek view of immortality of the soul with little regard for the body. But I want it to be clear that John does have the Jewish view that we find elsewhere in the New Testament of a bodily resurrection that's going to happen at the end of time. And so we start off with John chapter 5, where we have this discussion that we've already talked about with Jesus being the one who raises or who gives life and who is able to judge the dead. And this is an extension of the Father's activity in raising the dead and giving life. So there's some discussion here of people having crossed over from death to life, and the sense in which John's eschatology is inaugurated, and that people are already entering into the resurrection life, but there is still an expectation of a future resurrection. And so if we look at John chapter 5, verse 25, we find these words, "Very truly I tell you, a time is coming and has now come when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live." And if this is ambiguous, in what sense are they hearing the voice? In what sense are they dead even? And in what sense will they live? Then he specifies more carefully in 28 and 29. "Do not be amazed at this, for a time is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and come out. Those who have done what is good will rise to live, and those who have done what is evil will rise to be condemned. By myself I can do nothing. I judge only as I hear, and my judgment is just. For I seek not to please myself, but him who sent me." So we see here clearly he's talking about those who have physically died and are in their graves, and there is going to be this moment. He doesn't say here in verse 28, a time is coming and has now come. I don't know if that's there's some debate about how much significance to put on the issue of this time now having come, but perhaps there's something to be said for the fact that in verse 25 there may be this double entendre that people are already crossing over from death to life, but there is this future time coming when the voice of the Son is going to be heard, and people are going to be physically resurrected. They will be judged according to what they have done. This is something that in recent evangelical circles there have been some that have really tried to emphasize so much that salvation is by faith that they exclude this idea of judgment by works, but this idea runs throughout Scripture. Now, that doesn't mean that it's by works of the law, and that we need to take on particular laws of the Torah as distinguishing us, and we can then check off these accomplishments that we've done, and we're okay. Instead, it's what we see elsewhere. I mean, go ahead to chapter 6, where Jesus says, "This is the work of God, to believe in the one that he has sent." The ultimate judge of a person is whether or not they receive the Son. And so this is the key work that is to be done. Now, that's also not to say that, okay, everyone who has been baptized and has faith, check, you're good. Instead, we see that Jesus talks elsewhere in John chapter 8, for example, about abiding in him, abiding in his word, that he gives the command to love one another. And it's as we see disciples loving others, that now we see, okay, this person is going to be judged positively and is going to rise to a good future life, whereas the evil are going to be judged negatively. We also see the issue of resurrection in chapter 6, verse 39, where we have the statement, "This is the will of him who sent me, that I shall lose none of all those he has given me, but raise them up at the last day." Again in verse 44, "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws them, and I will raise them up at the last day." And so there is still this view in the Gospel of John that even though we have an inaugurated eschatology, the time is now here, there's still this last day, a day for the resurrection of the dead. And we see this expressed in John chapter 11. Lazarus is said to be sleeping. And this metaphor that we see in Paul for death is used of Lazarus. While his body is in the grave, he is considered in some sense to be sleeping. Martha comes to Jesus and says the same things that Mary is going to say later. "If you had been here, my brother would not have died." And Jesus says in verse 23, "Your brother will rise again." And she expresses the typical Jewish view, well, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. There's that expression again. We have to remember, she's not talking about a spiritual afterlife, disembodied afterlife, going to heaven when he dies, anything like that that's so popular in today's Christian eschatology, and that I think reflects biblical teaching that people do go to be with the Lord when they die. But there's a greater moment in the future. Not the moment when you die and go to be with the Lord, but the moment at the last day when your body is raised up. And she says, I know that that's going to happen. And Jesus says in verse 25, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? And so this is a little bit ambiguous. Okay, on the one hand, he says that the person, though he dies, shall live. And on the other hand, he says the person lives and will never die. And, John plays with this kind of ambiguity. It seems to be what he's saying is, okay, yeah, physically, people are still going to die. Spiritually, they live on. But there is still hope for resurrection life. There's an inaugurated eschatology. Excuse me for a moment. There's an inaugurated eschatology, but then there is this future hope of resurrection life. Now, of course, in verse 37, we see people objecting. Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? They're questioning, shouldn't he have been able to preserve life? And we know, as insiders, here's a little bit of dramatic irony. We know that, yes, Jesus is the one who gives life. Yes, Jesus can prolong life. And sure enough, in this story, he does raise Lazarus. And the raising of Lazarus is a foretaste of the final resurrection, which really is rooted in the fact that Jesus himself is resurrected. And so we have in the Gospel of John this emphasis on resurrection that's there alongside this inaugurated eschatology. Yes, people have life now, but there is going to be a greater experience of that in the resurrection that's anticipated in the story of Lazarus. Now, interestingly, in the Gospel of John, this is what precipitates Jesus' death. In the Gospel of Mark, you see that it's Jesus' act in the temple that ultimately gets the chief priests plotting against him. But in the Gospel of John, it's this raising of Lazarus. And so it says in verses 45 and 46, many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. By the way, here's another reason why we should understand this term Iudaioi, Jews, to be a loosely used term and used in different ways at different times. Here, it's not that the Jews are opposing Jesus. Many of the Jews believe in him. Some are reporting back to the Pharisees, which, again, is a reason to beware of the temptation to say, oh, the Jews rejected Jesus. No, we see here many believed in him. This leads to a meeting of the Jewish ruling council, the Sanhedrin, and notice what they state. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. John is giving for us insight into what he can tell is going on among the Sanhedrin. John wasn't there for that meeting. He probably doesn't have a detailed report of what was said, or any kind of report of what was said, but he knows the character of the Sanhedrin enough to be able to assess this is what is being stated here. The Sanhedrin really felt like it's all the people turning to Jesus, and it was that raising of Lazarus that ultimately did this. And what was the Sanhedrin afraid of? They were afraid of the Romans coming and taking away our place in our nation. Ironically, by the time John writes this, he knows very well that this is exactly what happens, and he probably attributes the fall of Jerusalem to the death of Jesus itself. And so they are exactly on the wrong path. So Caiaphas' statement is what John would say of the Sanhedrin. You know nothing at all. You are totally not getting it. Of course, John's answer is, you think that by killing Jesus, you're going to prevent the Romans from destroying our nation, when in reality, it is the killing of Jesus itself that results in the downfall of the nation. John doesn't spell this out so much as you have in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, especially in the parable of the vineyard and the tenants who are put in charge of the vineyard, and they see the heir come and they say, let's kill him, this is the heir. And it's because they do that the owner of the vineyard decides to kill them all and throw them out of the vineyard. And so we have this irony here that Christians widely believed that, okay, the very thing that brought about the fall of Jerusalem is something that was done in an effort to prevent the fall of Jerusalem. It was inevitable. And, Caiaphas makes a further statement here in verse 50. Nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. Now, of course, John sees in here a deeper message, that Jesus is specifically dying for the people. He is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. He is the sacrifice, the sacrificial lamb, sacrificed on the day of preparation of the Passover. At the moment that the Passover lambs are slaughtered, in that 6th hour, there's Jesus dying on the cross. And so John makes the point, Caiaphas prophesied here as high priest. Of course, Caiaphas really did not understand what he was saying. And Caiaphas is saying, oh, well, we're going to kill this one to prevent the whole nation from suffering. And in reality, again, there's irony on top of irony. His death is on behalf of the nation, but many in the nation do perish because of what happens here. And so just look at how John plays with these levels of irony here. There's also a statement made here in verses 51 and 52, where John points out that Jesus' death was not only for the nation, but also for the children of God who are scattered abroad. We should question what exactly is meant by this, and there's probably a double entendre here. So, first of all, we should point out Jesus is dying for the nation. I think the NIV even spells it out a little bit clearer and says for the Jewish nation, which I think is an accurate statement there, that John sees Jesus' death as the death of the King of the Jews that's making an impact on this nation, but he sees it as being broader. And he uses this term, the children of God who are scattered abroad, which Jews would typically understand to mean the diaspora, the children of God who are scattered. I mean, that word scattered is a diaspora term. And John likely means that first and foremost here, that it's not just for Jews who are in Judea, but it's for Jews who are scattered, perhaps in Ephesus, where he is ministering among a church that is probably made up largely of Jews. But John also, as we'll see in the next chapter, includes non-Jews in this and sees Jesus' death as being for the whole world, and that there could be children of God among the Gentiles who are not descended from Abraham, who are not born of the flesh or of father's decision, but they are born of God, and so there's we want to be able to see, okay, John is very much seeing the restoration of the scattered diaspora in Jesus, but it goes beyond just the diaspora. Much like what Paul does in talking about, using Hosea's teaching about God calling those who are not a people to be a people, where Hosea is talking about Israel and how they have been made no longer the people of God, but he can make them the people of God. And then Paul in Romans 9 through 11 comes back and says, well, if God can take the people that are not a people and make them the people of God, then God can do that for the Gentiles. And John is, I think, doing the same thing here, using diaspora language, but applying it more broadly than just to Jews. We should notice, by the way, we should note here, recent scholarship has been pointing out that Judaism at large was very open to including Gentiles. Previous scholarship said that this is what distinguished Paul from the typical Jew, is that Paul wanted to open the door to Gentiles, Jews didn't. No, we actually, from what we know of Judaism, there was a willingness to let Gentiles, they would call them God-fearers, be a part of what's going on in the synagogue and to relate with Gentiles a little bit more than what previous scholarship emphasized. This brings us to chapter 12. Paul gave us a presentation on verses 20 to 36. I want to highlight some other things in John 12. So we start off with the anointing of Jesus, and then we have Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. And John quotes two scriptures here. One of them is on the lips of the people who are saying, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." By the way, I argued in my doctoral dissertation that should be understood. The "in the name of the Lord" goes with blessed. Jesus' title is not the one who comes in the name of the Lord, but specifically Kamenos, the coming one. And we see this title sometimes where just the words "the coming one" is used of Jesus. In Luke's gospel, where John the Baptist, also in Matthew, it's in both passages, John the Baptist sends disciples to Jesus to say, "Are you the coming one, or are we to expect another?" Well, who is this coming one? John spells it out for us by having the people say, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel." And so it's the King of Israel. If you look back at Psalm 118, where that phrase, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord," it comes from, it's a messianic psalm that speaks. It's this royal psalm where you have this kingly figure speaking of having cut off all of the nations that are opposed to God, and that he is now becoming though he's this stone that the builders rejected, he has become the cornerstone, and the day of the Lord has come in him. And so there's the statement there. What is it? In Psalm 118. This is the day that the Lord has made, which often today gets applied, sometimes to Sunday or to any day in particular. But Psalm 118 is very much looking at, no, this is the day of the Lord. This is coming. It's inaugurated through this royal figure who comes in, and the people greet him as he comes into the temple with the words, blesses the coming one in the name of the Lord. And he's leading a procession, and they say to the procession, we bless you in the name of the Lord. Well, here's Jesus coming into Jerusalem, leading his disciples in, and the people are blessing the one who comes in the name of the Lord. And he comes riding on a donkey, which is a fulfillment of Zechariah 9, which is another messianic section. Read through Zechariah 9 through 13, and you'll find just how Zechariah is looking forward to the one who really inaugurates the ultimate new temple, and the one who really brings the people out of exile. And so John is portraying Jesus as the fulfillment of these expectations. We then have the Pharisees respond to this in verse 19. Look, the world has gone after him. And the word world has been used in different ways in the Gospel of John. Sometimes it's negative. It's this worldly system. It's the system opposed to God. Sometimes it's more God so loved the world. It's inclusive of the ones that God is redeeming. And here obviously it's more of the latter sense. But it's not just that the nation has gone after him. Now the world has gone after him. And so we're starting to see that this is broadening out beyond Israel. And this is why I think that double entendre is intended in John chapter 11. Because we have right after this, in verses 20 to 22, the Greeks are coming to see Jesus. And it's as soon as they come that Jesus finally says, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. In other words, now that the Greeks have come, now that the whole world is finally coming to Jesus, this is the moment for Jesus to be glorified. This is the moment where seeds are going to reproduce throughout the world, and there's going to be much fruit. This ties into a theme that has been running through the Gospel of John. So when Jesus did his first sign and Mary came to him about the situation with the water, Jesus said, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." When his brothers told him that he needed to go down to the feast and showed himself to the world, he said, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always here." When in chapter 7 they try to arrest Jesus, it says no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. And we have the same statement made in chapter 8, verse 20. And now that the whole world is going to Jesus, now we finally have the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. And so finally things are being inaugurated. A few verses later, Jesus is going to say, "Now is my soul troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this very purpose I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name." Similar to the prayer that Mark gives us in the Garden of Gethsemane, where we have Jesus saying, "Okay, not my will, but yours be done. I'm not going to ask for being saved from this hour. I'm going to ask for your name to be glorified." And we have the voice of God speaking that it is glorified, and Jesus makes this statement which ties in with all of this. The hour has come. Now is the judgment of this world. Now will the ruler of this world be cast out. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. He said this to show by what kind of death he was going to die. This statement of being lifted up is a significant statement. It ties back into Isaiah 52, verse 13, where God says that his servant is lifted up in the sense of being exalted, lifted to a position of glory. But at the same time, Isaiah 53 then follows that, depicting this one who suffered and who died for our transgressions. And so John uses this sense of being lifted up as a double entendre once again, that Jesus, when he is lifted on the cross, the people ironically think they are lifting him up to kill him, and they are lifting him up to the throne. They are exalting him, and now, because he is exalted, because he is lifted up to the throne, the ruler of this world is cast out, and Satan no longer has authority. All things have been put under his feet. And so here's a little bit more of this inaugurated eschatology. This sense that at the end of time there's going to be this battle, and God is going to slay Beliar in Jewish tradition. He's going to slay Satan. John sees it as, to some extent, happening that moment when Jesus is placed up on the cross. And this connects with other statements in the Gospel of John about Jesus' hour. John chapter 4, "The hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." Once Jesus is put on that cross, he is now the new temple of God. Destroy this temple and I will raise it up in 3 days. He is now the temple of God. No longer does Jerusalem or Mount Gerizim or any other location matter, because now the only location for worship of the Father is in Jesus spiritually, worshiping God in spirit and in truth. Likewise, chapter 5, we already saw that statement about the hour is coming when the dead will hear the voice of God, and those who hear will live. Now resurrection is able to happen. Not that at Jesus' death suddenly people's bodies are coming up out of their graves, although we do see that in the Gospel of Matthew, but that's not the fullness of the final resurrection. That's an anticipation of the final resurrection. The statement here is that because of what Jesus has done, the hour is now here. We're already experiencing resurrection life, but there is this further moment to come, this last day resurrection. We have in chapter 16 that he says the hour is coming when whoever kills you will think he is offering a service to God. And he specifically mentions the putting out of people from synagogues, which, as I mentioned when we met previously, I think is a big part of the setting of the Gospel of John. John is writing in the time when this happens, and he says, look, Jesus said it was going to happen, and this is really what happens because of Jesus' death. This hour has now come. The light has left the world, and now we're going to experience a little bit of the darkness. But also at the end of chapter 16, this statement that the hour is coming when I will no longer speak to you in figures of speech, but will tell you plainly about the Father. In that day you will ask in my name, and I do not say to you that I will ask the Father on your behalf, for the Father himself loves you, because you have loved me and have believed that I came from God. And so Jesus is saying, you now, this hour is coming when you have direct access to the Father. And interestingly, right after this statement is made, the disciples respond and they say, now you are no longer speaking in figures of speech and you're telling us plainly. So when Jesus says the hour is coming, it's right there in that moment. They finally get it. And because they get it, Jesus then offers up the prayer of chapter 17. And it's at this moment that he can be arrested and crucified, because now the hour is here. And another statement right there from the end of chapter 16. The hour is coming, Indeed, it has come when you will be scattered, each to his own home, and will leave me alone. Once again, that persecution is here, but take heart. I have overcome the world. The rest of John chapter 12, we have the crowds. They do not understand Jesus, and he says, basically, you need to understand while the light is still here. You've got the daylight to walk. You've got to get this. It's a call to repentance right now. And it says that though he had done so many signs before them, they still did not believe in him, so that the word spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. And he gives a couple different quotations of Isaiah about the obstinacy of the people. John makes the statement here that Isaiah said these things because he saw Jesus' glory and he spoke about Jesus. Now, you could go back and look at those prophecies in Isaiah and see, well, Isaiah is speaking about his own day, but there is a sense in which Isaiah saw something greater than his own day. What he was seeing in his own day was an anticipation of what would happen in Jesus' day, and ultimately, the greater referent of what Isaiah is speaking about is this moment in Jesus' day when Jesus is glorified and the people don't ultimately see it. Perhaps we could discuss this more if some of you are interested. It's an interesting issue where you have this concept that John has of Abraham, Moses, Isaiah having seen Jesus, and what they're seeing is this this exalted one that we know as the one who came to the earth, sent from the Father, and who went to the cross as the Lamb of God. So you've got this statement in verses 37 and 38 about they still do not believe in him, but then 42 to 43 point out, nevertheless, many, even of the authorities, believed in him. It's not just common Israelites, but even Jewish rulers are believing in Jesus. I don't know if he's thinking specifically of Nicodemus here, if he's thinking of others, but whoever he's thinking of, he's saying, look, there are others who believe in him, but for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, so that they would not be put out of the synagogue. Now notice this, for they loved the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. This is ultimately not a statement in favor of these authorities who believed, but it's a rebuke of them. And so I think Nicodemus is being rebuked, or at least challenged to be more than what he has been in the Gospel of John. I know that those of you that read Benema's text said that Benema sees sees Nicodemus more positively. I think that this is that Nicodemus is used as an example of what not to be. It's great that he believes, but you've got to come out into the light. And so again, that end of John 3, that section there, verses 19 to 21, where Jesus says, "This is the verdict: light has come into the world, but men loved the darkness because their deeds were evil." Everyone who, what does he say? He says, everyone who does what is right, or something like that, comes into the light. Are you going to come into the light? Are these authorities going to come into the light? This is a call to Jewish leaders. Come, don't just believe in him in secret. And by the way, there are stories for hundreds of years of Jewish leaders believing in secret. In one story, for example, you have a man by the name of Hillel II in the 4th century. And Epiphanius tells us a story about how he was baptized in secret. And the way that Epiphanius knows this is because a man who attended to Hillel II, he by the way, he would have been the top dog in Judaism in the 4th century. A man who attended him actually witnessed the baptism by peering through the crack of the door to find out what was going on when Hillel, on his deathbed, asked for the nearest Christian bishop to come. And so this man sees Hillel being baptized, And later, after Hillel dies, he finds copies in Hebrew of the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of John, and the book of Acts. And he starts seeking more. And eventually this man decides to become a Christian and befriends Epiphanius and tells him the story. And Epiphanius says that he met another man who claims to be a Christian in secret. And so here we are in 4th century. This is still happening. Many even of the authorities believed in him, but for fear of the Pharisees they did not confess it, so that they would not be put out of the synagogue. And once again, this suggests that the putting out of the synagogue is a key issue in the Gospel of John. We saw it in chapter 9. We're seeing it again here. This is a motivation for so many Jews not to follow Jesus. It's that decision that was made within Judaism. Some connect that to the Birkat Haminim, that curse that's spoken over heretics. It's that particular decision to force all Jews in synagogues to say these words that really precipitates the Gospel of John and forces people to make a decision. In my own view, this is the key issue in 1 John, where John talks about those who have gone out from us and they were not really among us. I think he's talking about people who, under pressure of the synagogue, have decided to go out. Others think that he's talking about Gnostics. I think that that's a misreading of 1 John, but that certainly is a common view, and a view that really connects back to Irenaeus. But I think Irenaeus is the one who invented the view, because Irenaeus was dealing with Gnosticism in his time period, and he saw it. He basically read it back into John's first epistle. But I don't know. That's another thing we could talk about when we're all together. If you are interested in it, I'm planning on writing an article on that particular topic. This brings us to the end of this section that really bridges the book of signs and the book of glory, John 11 and 12, which Burge has said is foreshadowing the death and resurrection. We have now seen that Jesus has power over the dead. He is the resurrection and the life. He was able to raise Lazarus. His body was anointed. He comes into the temple as the king, the stone the builders rejected. He's going to become the cornerstone. The Greeks have finally come to him. Now is the moment for him to be glorified. Now he is lifted up and exalted. And so this really leads us right into the Passion narrative. But before we get into the story of Jesus' crucifixion, we get the great farewell, as Burge calls it here, where Jesus teaches his disciples at the Last Supper, and that will be the topic of our next video.